And that's very interesting. This whole death and resurrection motif is right throughout this whole section of Romans, isn't it? And of course, Christ died and rose from the dead. So it's kind of a picture of moving from one level to a new level. And it's used a lot. We'll see in all of these passages, they're always talking about experiencing death, in quotes, as a dying experience. It's death to self is really what it is. And then the life replacing that. And so we get like Galatians 2:20, with another we could quote here, where he says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives within me. In the life I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God. That's the goal. To become Christ-like, to be conformed to the image of Christ, means there's less of self blaring out and coming across, and more of Christ. There's an impression of Christ that comes out. Now the problem is, all the things that we mentioned for nourishing the inner life, prayer, scripture, fellowship, relationships, all of these things are good for nurturing the spiritual dimension that's been planted in us, but they're completely ineffective. They do nothing to the old nature, which is still with us, the flesh nature. You can read the Bible to your flesh all night long and it won't do a thing. The flesh is so adaptable, it can even jump into spirituality. And, it's like, I'll be the loudest voice at the prayer meeting as long as you let me live. Let me be in control of your life. The flesh is adaptable. It can't be pinned down easily. And so this whole process of building up the inner man just has no effect on the flesh whatsoever. And so what we're going to learn is that God uses that which does affect the flesh, not spiritual truth and so forth, but rather outward circumstance. That's what our outer man, as Paul calls it, was made to respond to and to sense as the circumstances around us. And so God uses our circumstances like a hammer and chisel to start banging away at that old nature. And it cracks. That clay vessel cracks open. This is discussed, and I'm not going to read all the verses in Romans 8 in order because it's so long. But like in 22 where he says, we know the whole creation groans and suffers the pains of childbirth together until now. And not only this, but we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. And so, what Paul's teaching here is, the whole creation groans, meaning that we live in this fallen world. We're in a world that is fundamentally abnormal, in a broken state, nothing like what God intended for it. And when you live in a fallen world, you suffer. You groan. There is an unavoidable pain in life. It's unavoidable. Even though we may go on a frenzied quest to avoid suffering at all costs. The moment we start to feel down, we'll hit the bottle, shovel pills, run out and have a sex affair, whatever we think's going to make that feeling go away. There really is no escaping this. This is the world in which we live. And being a Christian doesn't change that. In fact, in some situations, we may find that we have more suffering in our lives because we're following Christ than we would if we weren't following Him. Some of this suffering is brought upon us because we're following Christ. In verse 28 and 29, he says, God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love God and those who are called according to His purpose, which is to be conformed to the image of His Son. The next verse there, 29. Now, it doesn't mean that God causes all things to happen to us. Rather, that He causes them to work together for good. So, a lot of the suffering happening in our life is not like God's sending bolts of suffering at us at all. It's that we live in this fallen world. And so there's suffering there. But God is channeling it and using it for our benefit, to shape us more into the image of Christ. That's the goal. back to 2 Corinthians 4. He goes on after saying this thing about the clay pot and the treasure inside. He says, we're afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We're perplexed, but not despairing. Yeah, affliction, a pretty broad term. We're perplexed, but not despairing. Yeah, affliction, a pretty broad term. Suffering. We're suffering in every way. Perplexity, that galling sense of confusion, of bafflement, what I should do, why are these things happening to me, and so forth. That's a form of suffering in its own right, just being baffled and confused. We are persecuted, but not forsaken. Persecution, well, Paul could talk about that. He was beaten, he was imprisoned, all these stoned one time, almost left for dead. All these things that he went through, and we have it pretty soft in this regard, frankly. Although we can anticipate some persecution even in our relatively liberal culture in which we live here. Liberal and tolerating toward most things, but not necessarily toward Christ. And so we will at times be put down, slammed hard by people, friends, even family members. And I know a lot of people here have put up with some pretty sharp abuse at the hands of others. That's an example of some of the suffering that wouldn't be happening if we weren't following Christ. We wouldn't be getting persecuted. We're struck down, he says, but not destroyed. Well, this whole process that he's describing involves various types of suffering and affliction that comes into our lives. And believe me, this can be pretty rough. He says, the point is that we're always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. There is that life out of death again, right? We bear the dying of Jesus so that the life of Jesus can be manifested in our body. This process intended to forge cracks, fissures, and whole chunks of this clay pot falling away to reveal the treasure inside. The kid says, yeah, I'm sick of my parents. Bastards. I'm getting out of here. I'm going to move into a ministry house. And God's like, yeah, that's a good idea. Why don't you move into a ministry house? I think a few of us have had that experience. And, a couple of years go by and he's just finally like, I'm sick of these selfish guys I live with. I'm going to get married. And God's like, yeah, why don't you get married? Good idea. And we have a role in this, okay? There's a role for us because we have to first of all understand what it is that God's doing in my life in bringing trial and affliction into my life. I have to cooperate with His work that He's trying to do by responding in faith. And if I'm resistant and all I can think of is how to get out of my trial as quickly as possible, we don't make much progress. Frankly, you can go through a lot of suffering even as a Christian and it doesn't do much. Doesn't seem to change the character much. Other people seem like they're being transformed by it. What's the difference? Their response.